feel like one of those like 60-year-old jiu-jitsu guys who's walking around like he's kind of hobbled, can't figure out why he ended up that way. It started way back in his 30s when he wasn't addressing the tiny nagging stuff that he thought he could get through.
Yo, what's up guys? This is Minju.
And Chris.
Yeah, so we're gonna be not spending so much time casually talking about bullshit.
Yep.
We're gonna get right into it, you know, make this nice and fast-paced and be educational at the same time. Yeah, so what are we gonna talk about today?
Repetitive stress injuries.
Repetitive stress injuries, okay, that's a mouthful.
Yep, RSI for short.
RSI, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's as simple as fancy words for a very simple common phenomena. If you use a muscle in the same pattern over and over and over again, it eventually decreases in its ability to recover. So then whatever training stress you put on it puts it that much closer to being a little bit overtrained, and the body will begin to give you clues well in advance of this, like aches and pains that just don't go away. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that is something that we hear people complain about all the time in any type of sports, right? Yeah, so, but specifically in jiu-jitsu, which is, you know, one of our main sports that we're focusing on right now, or MMA, what type of RSIs do you see among like jiu-jitsu people or MMA people?
Really frequent is shoulders or hips, and because it's always in a guard position, either upper body or lower body, the body's in a flexion posture, so it's always trying to close that joint and using muscles to pull together, and then under stress, somebody else is trying to open you up, you're trying to pull back. It's constant pulling on that joint in one direction.
Okay, all right, and then RSI, repetitive stress injuries, so it's defined by, so it's not like a sudden onset, like,
No, they take quite a while to like onset.
Okay, so what would be some of the clues, some of the symptoms, like, because I'm thinking it's probably the reason why some really bad injuries happen is because there's this underlying repetitive stress injury is already kind of going on.
Exactly.
And it doesn't get addressed over the long term, and then at some point something just snaps.
Yeah.
Right.
A good example would be from my own powerlifting history, actually, where I was playing basketball, then I would switch right back into powerlifting, but I had a nagging right hip the entire time, and it felt like initially just hip tension, hip tightness, and I was like, okay, I can brush it off, I'll just warm up and keep lifting. After a certain point, that hip didn't recover as well as it could have, and then one rep too many led to a hip slight subluxation. So there's a nice big pop and a more dramatic acute injury. But well before that was this indicators that like, okay, you've got hip flexor tension that's just not going anywhere. It's constantly bothering you. That's something to address before the joint loses its integrity.
Okay, cool. Wow, it's really cool that you said that, you know, about the hips, because I have a specific one as well. So this one was kind of brought up by one of my jiu-jitsu training partners at Lapel Arts. Big shout out to Lapel Arts, Lucas, Pauline, all those guys. So basically, what she told me was that she has what I think would be a textbook repetitive stress injury. So she's saying she has been for the last 6 months, left hip flexors, extremely sore, sometimes a little bit of pain, and then it's not a sudden onset. It kind of build up gradually over time. And then symptoms are, you know, if it hurts the most when she like tries to bend down to tie her shoes. And then when she's getting in and out of the cars, when she has to swing her legs around, then she really feels that. Massaging and stretching gives it temporary relief. But then it goes right back to how it is. And I think the last bit of information is that she trains jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, and weightlifting. So she's usually doing one of the three 6 days a week. All right, so how does that sound?
It would take a little bit of talking to her, exactly figuring out the details of when and where it really started coming up, other relieving or other aggravating factors. But from the initial sounds of it, all of those sports require a lot of hip flexion demand. So in Muay Thai and kickboxing, you're always raising the leg either to throw it again or to check a kick. In jiu-jitsu, you're always in your guard, so it's another flexed hip posture. And now that flexed hip posture, so a visual example is like always being here. So then the right hip flexor ends up getting quite tense and tight. It doesn't get the counterpointing stress. So anytime you take a movement now outside of your sport that mimics that motion, the muscles are still feeling relatively like locally overtrained and under-recovered. So doing something like stretching it out helps relieve some of that tension. Massage will also help relieve tension, but it's not doing anything to correct the underlying lack of recovery in the tissue, especially with such a high training load that tissue is never getting a chance to live in the opposite range, which would be full hip extension. Not sure if I can mimic it well on the camera, but this would be the exact opposite of where she likes to live, or even better, taking that hip and getting up into extension this way and allowing the front of the hip to start feeling like it has a chance to open up and not take all of the load for her activities.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. So I know we're not able to give the exact prescriptions or diagnosis for any particular situations.
Exactly.
Obviously, it's a fucking YouTube video, guys.
Yep. Yeah. Come see me if you've actually got something. We're aiming to educate.
But but from the sound of it, would you say that's some type of RSI potentially,
exactly.
right?
That would be something that you definitely want to go get looked at, diagnosed properly, like figure out where it is in the body,
Gotcha.
so you can create an exercise plan that properly addresses.
Gotcha. All right. So what would that look like? So let's pretend it's similar descriptions that I just gave you, but it's not pertaining just to her. This is like, let's talk about it in a very general stroke.
Yep.
Okay, so if those were the things that were brought to you, and you're like, okay, I can make some recommendations on, maybe you just talk about what could have been the cause of it, right? And let's talk about if you just kind of leave it and don't do anything about it, what would be some potential injuries that you could see down the road?
It could be anywhere from like as benign as just continual nagging pain and a little bit of a performance deficit, but depending on where things go, or if you end up in a sketchy scenario where those muscles really can't control the joint anymore, you could see anything from like a ligament strain, grade 1 to 3, denotes kind of how much of that ligament has actually been strained. So if you don't have the active muscle controlling the joint, it'll go to a passive structure, and those have a lot less capacity to deal with somebody jumping on you or you trying to throw or check a kick. You might get something where like constant performance deficit leads to pain down the line. So your body knows, okay, my hip isn't doing a great job flexing, let's recruit something else to try and make that happen. So bodies have about 1,000,001 ways to adapt to a specific injury, and then they'll just keep adapting. But the longer you go, the more performance deficit you'll see, the less recovery that you'll end up with. So you'll feel like one of those like 60-year-old jiu-jitsu guys who's walking around like he's kind of hobbled, can't figure out why he ended up that way. It started way back in his 30s when he wasn't addressing the tiny nag and stuff that he thought he could get through. And you could see anything from, basically like ligament strain, joint integrity issues, aches and pains down the line, performance deficits. Gotcha. It's hard to say exactly where it ends up, but it just sets you up for a lot of bad shit down the road.
Mm-hmm. So those were typically the type of stuff you might have dealt with in the past that all stem from not dealing with the repetitive stress injury
exactly.
in the beginning. Okay.
Yeah, deal with it when it's simple and easy and repeatable. So like if it's always when, okay, I bend over to tie my shoe, that's hip flexion, I know that's not well tolerated by my body. That's a lot easier to deal with than, hey, I was in a roll and suddenly my hip went pop and I lost control of my leg.
Because that would be a ligament strain.
Yeah, it could be a ligament, could be a labrum, like a hard or soft tissue structure in the hip itself.
So what type of injury caused by, what type of injury would take the longest time to recover? Because we don't want that, right? So what type of injury?
Anything where like a grade 2 or above muscle strain or ligament strain. I'm mixing up strain and sprain. You sprain a ligament, you strain a muscle. So if you get like anywhere over a grade 2, there's been actual tearing of the fibers, whereas a grade 1 is just a very rapid stretch that the muscles are having trouble recovering from. Grade 3 is a full rupture, and that requires a lot of work. Sometimes, like if you've seen those videos where a guy blows a pec bench pressing and it curls up into his chest, that's a grade 3 pec strain, and it's just straight up a tear in regular people language. So the muscles come unattached from its origin, and that takes forever to come back from. So well before that point is your RSI, where you're like, oh, my pec or my hip is a little tight when I do this specific motion. Deal with it then and prevent any potential injury down the line.
Wow, so it's kind of like the butterfly effect there, you don't know where the tiniest ripple from the flapping of the wings of the butterfly,
exactly.
what kind of tsunami is going to lead to.
Right? So crush the caterpillar even before it becomes a butterfly. As cruel as that is, those little guys, you just smack them.
Well, on that note, so let's talk about good ways to start being more, cognizant of the issue and what you can actually do to deal with it. I mean, obviously, come in and talk to Chris if you're in the area, but again, in a general rule of thumb, I mean, what would be something that could be done?
Basically spend more time in the opposite posture and train the antagonist muscle. So an agonist is whatever causes a muscle to take a certain motion. So your hip flexors, like psoas, the top end of rectus femoris, your quad muscle, both serve to help flex the hip, so they're the agonists of that movement. The antagonist is anything that opposes it. So the opposite of hip flexion is hip extension. That's like your glute thrusters or the top end of your deadlift when you're standing tall, and your hamstrings, glutes, and a couple other smaller muscles deep in the hip all help with that motion. So if you're a jiu-jitsu player or you're doing a lot of kickboxing, Muay Thai, that kind of thing, the body's kind of always in hip flexion to some degree. So to counterpoint that, start doing a little bit more hip extension work in your workouts. So get into a yoga class, do a little bit more like standing tall, think like warrior poses are pretty good for it, mountain pose, anything that gets you up and your hips open and extended is going to be very valuable. You could train it more with like glute bridges or even partial squats. A lot of people don't like them for like the powerlifting end of the world or bodybuilding, but if you have a specific purpose and you want to train your hip extension strength, then train that specific range, and it's going to go a long way in helping balance the stress in the joint. Yeah. Okay. Deadlifting is always a good one as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess the thing with deadlifting is if the form is bad, then they are actually using more hip flexors as well. So.
Or like they won't tend to use too much hip flexor. It depends on how they're getting into it.
Right.
But it's more so like, are they compromised in getting there because their hip flexors already don't like deep flexion? And that's where you can always modify per the person. Like see a professional, either a really well-educated trainer or a physio, and then they can tell you like, yeah, I wouldn't have you do this if you were bodybuilding, but we're not bodybuilding.
Right.
What we're doing is specific rehab so that you can get back to bodybuilding, back to jiu-jitsu.
I guess that is a really important mentality as well, right?
Exactly.
Because I think there's something going on right now where you see people like videotape people in gyms, like doing weird exercises and then making fun of them, right? You know, I think a big part of it is that they might just be doing something like that because they're rehabbing, they're doing specific ranges of that particular exercise just so they can get better, right? And then you got this fucking asshole videotaping that person, posting it online and making fun of them, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, if that is you, don't do that.
I don't think we have anybody like that watching, but if we did.
But if you do, stop watching, man. We don't want you watching our videos.
Everything is context dependent. So like you might see something that looks completely bonkers and out the window, and then if you actually talk to that person, they have a very specific intent for it, and it's not going to be the only thing they're doing in their training if they have a well-developed rehab or training program.
Gotcha. Yeah. So obviously you would probably again see a physio or a really good trainer to build up a program like that to work the antagonistic muscles.
Exactly.
Right. And what else can you do? Like any because you did talk about a lack of recovery, right? So what does that mean? Like train less or what is that?
It's either train less or modify your training. So you could spend the same amount of time training, but don't hard roll the entire time. Do more drilling, do more like we were just doing where like there's a designated winner and you can grade the intensity. So I've worked with a couple guys who had acute injuries, and as they're working back, we grade how hard they're allowed to roll, but it doesn't mean that they don't roll at all. Yeah, so like changing your intensity, or if you need to, take like 1 or 2 full days off and do an opposite modality or opposite exercise. So if you're doing a lot of jiu-jitsu, a lot of flexion, get into a yoga practice or get into like anything that opens the hips up instead and is very low intensity. And that keeps the muscles moving, keeps the joints moving so you don't lose any of your capacity, but it doesn't overstress the tissues in a very specific way that you've been using them.
Yeah, and I guess in the context of jiu-jitsu, you can also find positions that doesn't require as much activation of the hip flexors, such as top positions and stuff, right? Because it takes like an open guard, a typical open guard, obviously it's a lot more intense on the hip flexor muscles. But if you work on your top passing and stuff like that, then it's probably going to be a little bit better.
You could even go to something like drilling triangles from closed guard, because a lot of that is not quite hip flexion. It's actually squeezing in with like your knee flexors instead. And the hips are in an open posture, so you're starting to learn like.
Okay, we'll go over triangle finishing mechanics. That's the way that you said. No, that's not.
Okay, that's completely wrong.
That's probably. I mean, I wouldn't say completely wrong, but that's not going to be the most effective way to finish a triangle.
Gotcha.
So but that's a subject for another day.
Sweet. So. I'm always learning too, so this is excellent.
It's all good. Yeah. Nice. All right, cool. So this is probably where it would be good for our viewers to visually see an example of it. So I know, I know for hip flexor and stuff, we already talked about it. So why don't we talk about something else? So like, let's say if there's a repetitive stress injury in another part of the body, what would be some type of exercises that you can do? What would be the most common thing that you see all the time?
Gotcha. That's a good question. I see a lot of guys stuck in like that hunchback posture. So then they end up with a lot of stress and strain through the back of their neck. And it's as simple as getting into anything that allows you to upright, but in a way that you're not forcing yourself there. There's a difference between using all the stuff in your back to just extend versus actually getting tall and upright through the center pillar of the body. So it's almost less of an RSI and more a postural thing. but it plays on the same principles. It's just things you get stuck in the same position and your body can't find an effective way out. So stuff in the upper back is a lot of the time people are locked in and they're rotating as a chunk. So getting the arms loose, letting them fly free, and then doing any sort of like very slow or gentle thoracic rotation does a really good job of getting you out of flexion, because the facet joints won't allow you to play into rotation if you're flexed. If I'm stuck here, I can only go so far.
Yeah, I can already tell this is going to be really important, because that's the classic cell phone neck, isn't it?
Exactly.
Right? When you're on your phone the time like this. So let's talk about that thoracic rotation. What would be something that's really simple somebody can do just sitting in their office chair?
In the office chair, link the hands together, pull just lightly so that you feel some tension in the shoulder blades, and then start gliding, and imagine generating it from your spine rather than just trying to whip an elbow around.
All right.
Yeah.
Good. So basically, let's like, spine.
Exactly.
Move us.
And if you start making faces like that and it starts feeling really stiff, the slower you go, the better a chance you get to feel out exactly when you begin to lose your movement. And that's where you want to sit into it. Okay, I'm stiff here. Deep breath in, thinking of expanding from the inside out rather than just forcing your tissues to go further. And that gives the joint a different proprioceptive input, like, different sensory information.
Gotcha. That was a good one. That was really good. Thank you. So a recap then. All right. So repetitive stretch injury. Do not wait until it snowballs into something that's going to be way more severe. That's going to take way longer to deal with and to recover. Right?
Exactly.
In some cases, you're never the same again, right?
Yep. Totally. The body can recover and become incredibly impressive afterwards, but it's always going to remember in some part of itself, in the back of your brain, or even in the joint itself. Like the last time we were here, something really nasty happened. We don't really want to go back there unless we have to. And you don't want too much of that to add up on you.
Yeah, that's why some fighters need to retire, because as soon as they go into the cage, the body goes, oh shit, here we are again. Something nasty happened last time.
Exactly.
Fuck, I'm out of here.
Like the conscious brain, if you're motivated, driven, you've got intention or like reasons to be there, it'll force you through it, but your body's going to have other opinions about that, and you end up with compromised performance and risk.
Right. Obviously, we're not naming any names and stuff, right?
Everybody knows somebody like that.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. So again, this is super important. Don't wait until it gets to the point that it's going to become super severe. So you can text Chris. We have the number right here on the bottom of the video. We have the email address. If you go into the description of the video, you'll see a direct booking link. If you're in the area, you can book with Chris directly and come see him, and he's awesome.
Exactly.
All right, and just like that, here is another episode of Krammer Talks Physio, and we're always working on different topics, so we would love to hear your questions and what issues you would like us to talk about. So again, you can email him directly, text him with the questions, or you can just leave a comment below and we'll get to you. And like and subscribe.
All the YouTube things, basically. Yeah.
And hit that bell notification.
Exactly.
I need to
How many times have we heard that?
I know, I need to.
That's great.
That's good morning.
That's all good.
Right.
Cool.